Welcome to the Web Platform Podcast, a developer discussion that dives deep into all things web. We discuss topics relevant to developing for the modern web and the web platform of today, tomorrow, and beyond. This is the Web Platform, episode number 101, Browser Wars and Standards Battles. And on our panel today, we have Danny Blue.
Hey, everybody.
And myself, Eric Isaacson. And our guest today is Brian Kardell. And he has been a very strong force in the standards for the web over the past few years and beyond that. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to?
Well, I started using the web in about 1995, and I've spent a long time kind of just as a developer watching it from afar, and it didn't seem to be working out real well. So I started following a little bit more closely, and then I got actually involved around maybe 2009, 2010. Then we co-wrote the Extensible Web Manifesto with a whole bunch of people. I won't list names because that will be long and awkward. You can go look. And,
I signed it.
And since then, we've just been working on kind of fleshing out that vision and getting changes to the necessary standards bodies, getting developers aware, and now I'm working on this thing, chapters.io, and I think we'll get a chance to talk about that. So that's me.
Most definitely. So you've been coding for a long time, and you got into the standards around like 2009, 2010. So we had Jacob Rossi and Travis Lighthead from the Edge team on. And after the podcast last week, we were just chatting about all of the history of browsers and what has happened since then. Like all the pain that we felt as developers using having to manually create image maps, having to do like IE6 hacks just to get things to work.
Yep.
Dev tools were almost like
non-existent.
Yeah,
they were non-existent at some point.
You were just throwing darts at your browser and trying to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, I remember the first time I used Firebug, and I was like, "What is this? Why I need this? I need this. Thank you."
It was so eye-opening, right? You're like,
"Yeah,
what? Why didn't they ever start with? Why didn't they have this initially?"
Exactly.
And what now? Like their entire online course is about how to use different sets of browsers, developer tools.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is always a crazy thing because right now it seems kind of basic. Right now there is a web developer somewhere that does not know that they have access to that stuff.
Isn't that crazy? Like
somebody just starting out. Yeah, it's in 2000. So I started my first job before I knew that those existed. And the first time I found them and I just like changed CSS properties and things were moving around on the screen, I was like, this is literally the best thing that's ever been made. Nothing can ever get better than this.
Yeah, and the early ones didn't even have that. They just had basically like a script debugger, and even that was really shoddy. Like the one in IE6 had these like things where you couldn't set a breakpoint on the first line of a function, all kind of weird stuff.
Yeah, it was never identical to the emulators for IE6, which is awful.
Yeah, but they were a huge boon. I think it would have been really hard to get here without them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The dev tools was like a plugin for IE7. I remember you had to actually go and download it. Like some developer created it and they incorporated it.
There were actually two. I don't know if you know this, but there were two, and even in IE6 there were like two. So if you had Visual Studio, you got like the high quality one, and then there was another one that was the Microsoft Script Debugger, and that was terrible. That was just like really bad.
That was bad.
I know like a lot of people who unfortunately got the crappy one, and then somehow had to figure out how to get it to switch, and it was really painful.
Yeah, I remember there was, for HTTP debugging, you had Fiddler, which was kind of ahead
Still
of...
around.
Still around, yeah. And it was really good because you could get... It was a separate application, so it wasn't dependent on the browser, and you could just, monitor your HTTP requests. We have much better tools now, but Fiddler's still pretty awesome.
And Fiddler has actually got a lot of interesting new things too, like since then. But Fiddler was also huge, yeah.
And Firefox, I remember I had to do. There was a plugin I had to get called Live HTTP headers before you had like the network tab.
I remember that.
Yeah, it was.
That's pretty neat, though.
Yeah, it was pretty good, but back then we didn't have to do as much debugging of asynchronous code as we have to do today.
Yeah. I know, like XML HTTP request, which has a crazy history on its own, but like when we started using that, really a lot of things just used the synchronous mode of it because like the async stuff was so much harder.
I didn't even know that you could do that. I didn't even know that you could do synchronous XML HTTP requests until until like a year and a half ago or so, where I started messing around with web workers and service workers, and I was using it inside there, and like I guess I had the flag on, and because now it throws a warning if you try to do it synchronously. Your browser will actually give you a warning, be like, you probably don't want to be doing this synchronously. But until that point, I didn't even know you could do that.
I'll call that a win because because it really shouldn't have been there in the first place, but it was, and now we do everything we can to discourage it. So,
so you said it had an interesting history.
Yeah, it was originally shipped with the Microsoft browser for, I guess, like Outlook, effectively. Basically,
which I think used the engine for IE, right?
Yeah. I think it was shipped like originally as like a Java thing, and that's part of the reason it has weird, strange, cryptic stuff. And then it turned out that it was really useful, and they, just standardized it. Well, I think actually not just they standardized it, but like Microsoft had it, and
so
needed it, or Mozilla maybe at that point.
You were developing in the mid to late 90s, right?
Yep.
So when you were dealing with this, like I was doing some mostly artwork, right? Design, and you're an artist as well. So if you haven't checked out Brian's paintings, he's pretty awesome, and he pumps them out quick, bastage. But they're really good. And I was doing a lot of art, and then I got into design a little bit, and it was really daunting back then. And the browser wars were just starting. Like Netscape was really taking shape, trying to get ahead of Internet Explorer, and it succeeded in some ways.
The inverse actually. Like
it failed in some ways as well.
No, I mean the inverse. There's, I don't know, we could call it like a deep history before 1994, but Mozilla started, I'm sorry, not Mozilla, Mosaic. Mosaic like turned the world upside down in the sense that before Mosaic there was a ton of web browsers. Like, think maybe 92, 93, I talk about this in my talk, 92, 93, there were 22 known websites in the world. 22, right? There were like 7 browsers. Like early web people made browsers, right? Like it was really
relationship there.
It's like 1 in 3 made a web browser at that point, which is kind of crazy. But like they were, when you say enthusiast, they were really enthused. And part of the reason, I think, is because Tim's original proposal was
Tim Berners-Lee, right?
Sir Tim Berners-Lee. It was kind of, it wouldn't have gotten very far because it was really weak. It didn't have forms, didn't have scripts, didn't have CSS, didn't have tables.
No tables.
It didn't have scripting. Yeah, no, it had. It was text. I mean, it was enough to do typewriter text on a page. That's what it was. I don't know. We can come back to that deep history stuff if you want, but when Mosaic came around, that was the one that like the general public started to pay attention to. And when I say general public, I mean people wrote stuff about it, and still, wasn't that many people. And then Netscape came along, and Netscape like changed the world. Like that was, everybody used Netscape people used to say, are you on Mosaic or are you on Netscape, rather than are you on the internet or the web? And they had, something like 95% market share, and Microsoft wasn't even in the game. And then Microsoft entered the game. They licensed a thing called Spyglass, and they started to contort it to meet their needs. And there was the browser wars, and at the end of the browser wars with IE6, Microsoft controlled 95%. And then it was a wrestle to try and get it back, but yeah. So I don't depending on when you came in to the browser wars, there were these major battles that completely flipped the course of things. Like Netscape was a behemoth that controlled everything, and then it was Microsoft, and then it was from now wrestling back.
Yeah, I started in the early 2000s doing design, and so I was sort of afraid of code, especially JavaScript, and back-end code was oh my god, you got to be really, really smart for that. And working with HTML tables, and I was doing basic HTML, and I took to CSS pretty quick because of my art background.
Mm-hmm.
And so getting to visually see that right away.
Yeah.
But it was still Internet Explorer 6 was kind of new still. I could go on lynda.com and pull down the videos through A6. If you go into their cache.
Yeah.
They have a script now. You can't do that, so don't try it, people. But but yeah, back then, I was trying to learn as much as I could, so I was watching a lot of lynda.com stuff, and I was teaching some of the courses on design and art, and that's how I taught myself to do a lot of the coding.
Nice.
Was by teaching as well, and the students taught me so much. It was a really enlightening experience.
It really is. Just as an aside, it really is amazing how much you learn yourself teaching someone else, right?
Yeah.
Something everybody should try to do.
Yeah, even if it's not in a class or something like that, if you're doing a blog post or trying to give a talk or something about that, you almost kick yourself in the butt a little bit, because you're oh man, all right, if I'm actually going to be because it's different when it's just you and your buddies, gathered around, bickering about X, Y, or Z. But when you're about to go give a talk or put something out in the public, you're all right, I really need to make sure that I know what I'm talking about.
Or even just peer program with somebody with sort of a radically different background and skill set. That also for me, frequently, I have to sit down with people who come from some other area, and when you start talking about these things, you realize not just maybe that you're not explaining them well, but some of their questions sometimes make you realize that maybe you don't understand it as well as you thought you did.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me a lot of times. Yeah. Where I'd be oh, I didn't think of it that way. I didn't think to approach it that way at all.
Exactly.
Let me try that.
That's also one of the reasons it's good to sometimes even break away. I know we're kind of going off on a little bit of a sidebar here, but also try doing different stuff. I love JavaScript. I do a lot. I'm a web developer by trade. That is my job. But in my spare times, I've messed around with building small games in Unity. I got one of my friends, Cody Henthorn, who's one of the smartest guys I know, but I made him start teaching me C, and he tried to get me to write ASCII checkers in C. But there's little things like that, and where you think so. A lot of times, if you don't have any other examples in your head of the way things are, you think that something is very specific to what you're doing, and a lot of times it's not. So it's nice to get that broader look at things sometimes.
Yeah, standards actually have this problem. If you can, that's, I don't know, maybe that's a weird segue to say standards have this problem, but
I think it's perfect.
Standards are not good at anticipating what is outside the standards bubble. I don't know how many people know this, but like I said, Tim Berners-Lee's original proposal was quite a lot different. He imagined that we would have apps and things, and that they would come across HTTP and all that kind of stuff. That part isn't foreign, but he didn't think all of that would be HTML. He thought HTML was something completely different.
Well, the implementation is never what you think it is.
Right, right. And I don't know if you ever read any of my blog posts, but I cite examples of that. There's a really great thing. Stephen Johnson is an author. He wrote a whole bunch of books about all kinds of interesting things. It's actually, if you have Netflix, you can see you can look up. He did a series on there, really good. But he talks a lot about examples where, like, these things we take for granted every day, like they were created for some other purpose. Like their inventors thought that it would be something else. So that's one of the problems with standards, is that without those outside voices and seeing what people can do, it's really hard to know what they can or will or what they'll expect.
So with that, can you take us through kind of like not like the full life, but kind of like the life cycle of how a spec maybe gets from, so like how we get from Tim Berners-Lee saying, okay, we should be able to send these text documents across, to what it is now. How come HTML changed instead of something else replacing HTML for a lot of the stuff that we use it for now?
Yeah, well, even Tim and most of the people in W3C wanted to replace it. They wanted to replace it with XM everything, like XML, XSL, XSL.
That's how HTML, XHTML came about, right?
Yeah, and the funny part a lot of people don't realize about this is that like XHTML really changes sort of everything, and a lot of people looked at it like, well, you just make sure that you close your tags. Your tags should be lowercase. Make sure you quote all your attributes. And you're kind of good to go. You just use the XHTML thing at the top. And people said, oh, yeah, I did XHTML. But there's this thing in the HTML spec that way down at the bottom called Appendix C. And Appendix C was this compromise where it was like, well, I don't think people are really ready for this. And so if you send, XHTML style markup, but you don't set the XHTML MIME type properly, we'll still treat it as HTML. Even most people who think that they did HTML, they really didn't, because it was actually quite a lot different. Like, there are changes, impacts to all kinds of things.
I am taking that off of my resume now.
But that's kind of how we. So I guess that was kind of the driving force behind what we now know as HTML5, right? I would imagine like that's what so is HTML5 trying to. So HTML5 is really when I started. So I really started doing stuff in 2011 or so. Mm-hmm. So like that's right around where the idea of HTML5 was starting to be a thing. So was HTML5
debatable?
So, but like what? So I guess what were the core concepts behind it, and what was it trying to fix then? Was it trying to fix like the XHTML stuff?
So you had asked earlier, like how we got to here, I guess, like how. Yeah. So obviously, when Tim started, there was no W3C, right? And so it was an IETF thing. He shared a proposal to Hypertext News Group, and I think they created like an RFC in the IETF, and they have their own processes, and that didn't really work out. I don't think that there ever was actually like something accepted as a standard in IETF for HTML. And then they started the W3C, and one of the problems that they were having was that SGML, which is so we see things and we say they look like XML or they look like HTML because they have like angle braces and quoted attributes and tree-like thing. That actually comes from like the late 60s. These guys at IBM created this thing, GML, which is actually an acronym for their initials, or initialism for their initials. I'm not really sure, but that became SGML, and that was an international standard in like very close to when I was born. It was a past international standards checks. Became officially a standard, I think, in like 85 maybe.
So that was after DARPANET and the internet had come about, right?
Yep. And this was already like a mature thing, and it was capable of like so much. And when Tim came along, he said, well, it should kind of look like that. But he didn't really know HTML, and so he just sort of faked it. No, really.
Proof that faking until you make it works.
No, yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. In fact, he didn't even really invent the initial language. Like what he did at CERN, they already had lots of HTML, and so he grepped their library and said these things look like they're widely used, so let's just call them the core language.
My console.
Yeah, right. So the problem that they were having is that the SGML people, the international community of SGML people who had built their lives around SGML and all these ideas, they were giving HTML really a lot of crap, and so they came up with this idea that they could somehow bring everybody together, that maybe HTML wasn't really very good, and we could plan this successor. They went down this decade-long path, and somewhere in there, they basically decided to stop work on HTML. Brendan Eich, creator of JavaScript, and Ian Hickson, and boy, I feel bad that I can't remember who else, but a bunch of them sort of defected and created the WGWG to keep HTML5 alive, to try and drive forward the things that basically W3C wasn't working on. I don't know, I think it's kind of proof that it's really requires acceptance for, wide acceptance for something to really be a standard. It doesn't matter who writes it down or who calls it official if we don't use it.
I remember, well, I don't remember specifically, but I remember hearing Brendan Eich talk about, how that all came about with JavaScript, and how, Java and JavaScript are the same age. A lot of people think that one is older than the other, and
very roughly, within a year.
Yeah, the name was sort of just a marketing type of thing, from what I understand.
It was originally called Mocha, I think.
So I mean, it seems like a lot of these things happened, coincidentally, even like you were saying. Yeah. What if he didn't take on that HTML? We would have no HTML. What would it be like today?
Mm-hmm.
And he came out of Netscape, right? He was one of the founders of the Mozilla, was he?
Yeah.
And so from that, I remember Firefox and Netscape were both out together at the same time at one point. And I think Firefox, when I first started using it, was like a 1.2. And that was where I first started saying, I can probably do some web development. I felt so much more comfortable because of the way Firefox allowed me to debug visually.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, the history right there, what for me was the start of the web that we have today. How do you see it, since you have a more holistic view on it all?
If you ever read any of my stuff or you listen to my talks or anything, I use the concept of evolution a lot, because I feel like it really is a lot like what you said, where in many cases it's like almost coincidental, the things that take off. You don't know. We had Betamax and VHS on the market at the same time. Betamax was, nobody disagrees, it was technically superior, but people chose VHS.
They were just
why?
Sony haters.
I don't know why. SGML had every conceivable advantage, and yet the world chose HTML. Why? I don't know. We can speculate, but I don't know, because we can't go back and run that experiment.
And people say the same with JavaScript too. So why
absolutely,
that language is so awful? And I'm like, no, it's flexible.
That's interesting. Robert Caillou, do you know who he is? He is. Some people call him the co-creator of the web, co-inventor of the web.
No.
I think co-conspirator is probably a better
He was
thing.
the shadow, the
he
shadow
was,
dom guy.
Yeah, he was Tim's. With Tim credits in the book, I think, says that like we couldn't have had the web without him because he was really good at doing some things that Tim wasn't really interested in or wasn't good at, and together they kind of got it off the ground. But it's funny because early on, Robert said he advocated that we have like some kind of scripting language. Viola, which was like maybe the third or fourth browser ever written, was kind of like the hot Java browser. Like it had a VM and like it had like embeddable applets and it had CSS, like not what we call CSS, but it had style sheets and everything. Like it was super, super visionary, and it had a scripting language. And so like people knew that, or thought even back then that we needed this. And when JavaScript came along, the reason I'm bringing this up is because you said like, you know, some people say it's kind of terrible. Robert Caillou said the most catastrophic, abysmal thing that happened in the history of computer software or something like that. It was really, really harsh, like really harsh.
Yeah, it's brutal.
That was his evaluation of JavaScript.
Well, it's still just kind of weird looking back. Again, you know, like I find a lot of stuff really interesting, especially the stuff I wasn't around for and didn't really get exposed to, but because this is just what I know, right? Like I don't know, like, you know, don't have a real good understanding of where a lot of it came from and all of the twists and turns that it has taken. But when you do start talking to people like yourself that just knows a lot about this stuff, you're like, man, why don't they just burn it down and start again? Like almost how is almost how it sounds, because it just seems bad. It just seems like a bad idea that people just kept trying to duct tape together, and that's what seemingly what the current web platform kind of looks like.
So there's very, very high cost to throwing it away and starting over, right? This is the thing that standards have always been really good at, is building the long infrastructure that we'll have for 50 or 100 or more years, right? Like we still have a lot of infrastructure for trains. When houses were originally wired, it was for lights, like screw-in lights. There was nothing else. I mean, there were no appliances. Like there were no plugs, because what would you plug in, right? And from that, people made appliances that you would screw into the light bulb socket.
Really?
Really, absolutely.
That's
and
really cool.
yeah, and if you actually look at the history of like all of the things that we've standardized and that have come about, a lot of them follow similar trails like that. Evolution is really powerful. The problem is that we don't historically tap into that. We tap into some other thing that's like, I know, creation myth we tap into, you know, like we think that standards can create things. That's actually mentioned earlier, the Extensible Web Manifesto. That's part of the idea there, is that we need to tap into that and give developers the sockets that they can screw into, so that we can see what do they build. If we give them new DNA, what will you do with that? Nobody foresaw the things that came after, you know, whether it's the HTTP or XML HTTP request, or we need to get the DNA out there and see what they do. So that's the idea of the Extensible Web Manifesto, and we'd like to see, you know, here are some outlets, and if we have ideas, even browsers, even the Google team or anybody, like if you have an idea and it can be implemented in JavaScript, go ahead and implement it in JavaScript so it works in all browsers. Let's not create more of this stuff. You know, we'll figure out, because experimentation is necessary, right? Like the only way that evolution really works is things have to fail.
Yeah, we were saying that at the last podcast with Microsoft guys, you know, that we appreciate the diversity in the browser engines too, because that'll create innovation in itself by having that diversity, because having everybody do the same thing is going to, you know, will definitely make that thing better and better, but it's not going to make really wide scope changes. It'll get narrower and narrower as the project goes on.
It's actually, I think, probably the best thing that came out of the WhatWig thing is that one of the things that they decided to do was like actually spec out how it works. So there were a lot of things that you would observe were the same at the output, but there were too many things unspecified, and so they went through and spelled out all those ways. Browsers were working differently and tried to get agreement on these arcane things, like these really, really arcane things that are the things actually that ended up causing a lot of pain for a lot of people.
My first class that I took in design, even for the computer, was for Quark, and I was learning.
Express.
Yeah, I was learning Quark Express, and that was like for print stuff. And I learned InDesign after that when that finally came out. But doing print work, back then, print was still an industry that was, not necessarily thriving, but it was still doing very well. And so you had a lot of people seeing that the web was getting, bigger and bigger, and oh, well, now I have to get into the web. I'm a designer. I design for print. And so they were taking what they knew from print world and trying to fit it into the web world. And then slowly people started to say, no, you can't do that. And then a whole bunch of these innovative ideas using CSS and HTML came about. At least that was my take on it when I was watching.
I think really one of the most interesting things that sort of proves that this is a good thing. I think people beat around the same facts and sort of come to slightly different conclusions. But if you think about this period where they were doing XHTML, and I guess maybe, Nanny, you were just coming into like the HTML5 thing, like right in this period, nothing happened in browsers because IE6 was like gone. Like they disbanded the team. Nothing changed in web browsers. Not one byte of code changed. And yet during that decade, if you were on, your experience got so much better. And if you were developing, your experience got so much better. And it's because we had some time to think about like how to deploy this DNA to explore all these different things. And so if we would have said, we need those things to standards bodies, they would have been like, no, you can't do that. It's the fact that developers were figuring it out. And I think actually Remy Sharp, when he coined polyfill, I guess the only way we got here, you asked before, like, how do we get here? There's this chasm, how do you cross, where Microsoft, who controlled 95% of the market, they weren't even making a browser anymore. Like, it was the same browser from a decade ago, How do you get there? The answer is developers. Developers can polyfill.
And projects like jQuery came out of that era because we had, the Internet Explorer 6 dominated, like you said, and Internet Explorer 6, as we know, had all these ActiveX objects, and things were not standardized. You had JScript, you had, things like attach event rather than add event listener in JavaScript. You didn't have...
had expressions in CSS.
Yeah, and style sheets were entirely different in how they work.
Yeah.
So it was a challenge, and so I think the jQuery team in particular really took up that challenge, and I think that's why jQuery was so successful, because A, it was very easy to do, to use, because you chain everything together, but it evolved into what we have specs now that we really don't need a lot of the jQuery stuff, but what they did was they gave us a lot of cross-browser compatibility.
Yeah.
And today, we take it for granted because a lot of things get put into browsers quickly. They have life cycles that are very, very fast. JavaScript didn't change for like 9 years, I think, or something like that, before we got that next update to ECMAScript 5. And the browsers were very, very slow. It was like very waterfall development. But now it's changed. It's amazing.
I think that in general, standards are just slow, and that when occasionally you have something that appears fast, it's either not really a standard, it's still an experiment, or it's actually the result of many things maturing at the same time that have been through this long process. Like I use the example of Flexbox. It feels like I know people in CSS that are like, who are into CSS, who are like, man, there's all these new things, there's Flexbox, and like, it just feels like standards are moving so fast. But like, the story of Flexbox goes back to like the early 2000s at least. So
yeah,
like that's not fast. I don't know, like compared to geology, maybe it's fast, but
in the grand scheme of the universe, it's pretty quick.
It's pretty quick, but for you and I, who have projects that ship on, schedules that are measured in days or months.
When I look at like some of the standards committees that are out there, the standards bodies, like ECMA, and you talked about this a little bit, and about the jQuery group, the organization, the foundation.
Mm-hmm. jQuery Foundation.
Yeah, so these committees and work groups, which ones are relevant today? How do they work? Because like I look at specs as a developer on like GitHub or W3C, and it's interesting to me. I don't understand all of the complexities because I'm not in that design of it, but I'm trying. It's hard for developers to really read through, I think.
It is really hard, especially when you get like things that are on the fringe. That could sort of go either way, and sometimes there's disagreement about who owns the standard.
So how do we help as developers then to provide that feedback to the work groups?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of JavaScript, it's ECMA is the standards committee. In terms of HTML and the DOM, it's a toss-up between WebWig and W3C. Like most of the practical work, I think, day-to-day kind of stuff is definitely WebWig. And when it comes to CSS, it's W3C. And when it comes to protocols and things, it's IETF. All of them work differently, and interestingly, pretty much all of them were created because the one before it was failing at doing what they wanted to do. So how can we help standards? I think the way that we help standards is by getting a voice into standards. We have jQuery Foundation and people involved in the jQuery Foundation, Yehuda Katz, Paul Irish, Adi Osmani, Rick Waldron, lots of people involved with jQuery Foundation were influential in getting the Extensible Web Manifesto out there, and that says that we want them to focus on low-level things, like not these high, lofty dreams that involve lots of speculation, and let's figure out a socket, right? Like, let's give them some new DNA. Those are smaller, and they're easier to get agreement on. Getting regular releases from them, it was also really important, but then kind of opening up the process is the last thing. And I think that's where developers can come in, who spend a fairly long time now, a year and a half, 2 years, trying to change the procedures and policies in standards to help encourage involvement. Chapters, this thing that I set up, there's a web incubator community group that's part of the W3C, and they have a thing, discourse, that they run. You can go there and you can discuss anything. You can propose anything. You can shoot down anything. And the idea there is that ideas should be able to fail out there before they go anywhere else. They should be incubated. We should see what picks up or what better ideas it spawns or whatever. And if you can find some critical mass, then that stuff can go into standards. That's worked a little bit. And chapters, I think, is the natural next step to that, which is taking this to meetups and having meetups look at the things that are proposed in incubation and contribute to that, and maybe use it to get their real jobs done. That's important because the economics are totally broken. You can't, if you needed Flexbox in 2003, all the period from then until now, you couldn't wait for it, right? Like, you had to get a job done.
Yeah, you still had stuff you had to do. It does seem like CSS is maybe a little, at least to me, seems like a little bit more of a sticky wicket than maybe some of the JavaScript stuff. And maybe that's just because we were talking about polyfilling and things like that. It feels like a lot of stuff in JavaScript is maybe easier to polyfill than a lot of the CSS stuff, because I think there are some, because pretty much any CSS polyfill that is written is JavaScript, pretty much. And they can get, I actually think we're just talking about like how messy some of those must look like. The polyfill for Flexbox can't be a really pretty thing.
Yeah, it's probably not a really pretty thing. Yeah. I've written some not pretty things for CSS. It's actually part of the thing that got me interested in this, is that you could kind of polyfill lots of stuff in HTML. You could polyfill lots of stuff in JavaScript. But CSS was like historically openly hostile to polyfill. No, really. I mean, that is actually the reason for Houdini. Houdini is a task force set up by the W3C tag and the CSS working group to do what it says in the Extensible Web Manifesto and find all the stuff that's down there, the primitives, the extension points, find all the sockets in the DNA that exist in the platform, and open it up to developers so that that is not as challenging as it was.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing project. We have to get Surma and some people on for that.
That would be super cool.
So you also just mentioned, so you mentioned chapters.io at the very beginning, and you just brought it up again now. So why don't we dig into that, and why don't you tell us a little bit more about what exactly chapters.io is?
Yeah, so it came from a lot of the discussions that we were having about how you get developers involved. The way that you would typically be involved in standards is one of two things. You either join a mailing list, and I would suggest probably don't. Or if you were a member, or in some cases you don't have to be a member, but you would go to a physical location where they have these face-to-face meetings. How does that work at scale, right? Like, that doesn't work at scale. Historically, standards have not figured out how to do this. Meetup.com has 4 million people signed up as web developers. That's not all web developers, but it's the ones that are kind of willing enough to go find meetup.com, sign up, and actually go to one of these things.
It is more than a handful of people in a room.
It is a lot of people, right? There's no physical venue that you could set up that could accommodate 4 million people, and even if you could get them there, everything would be a mess. So Chapters is a way to network this, to distribute it, and it basically partnering with meetups, because there's lots of meetups already, to say, there's no set way to do this yet. Maybe there won't be. Maybe flexibility is a good thing. But lots of these places have things like build nights where you just get together and build stuff and help mentor one another. And others have things that are specifically about standards, whatever. But the idea is to go there and show people the early things and get them to have all of those conversations, just 50 or 60 or 100 people at a time, or 10 or 5. It doesn't matter, because that's 5 or 10 that weren't there before. Collect that feedback in a shorter form and shove it back into standards that way. So collect groups of voices and groups of feedback and carry those back into standards.
So if I'm a developer and I want to, let's say I have an idea that, JavaScript has this data object that's totally messed up. I need to add, strip time and all these other things. If I had some proposal, I would go to one of these Chapter.io meetings online or through a meetup, and then get feedback based on that. Is that how it would work?
That's it, yeah. Or if, let's say, for example, there already was a proposal for better ways to deal with date, because there are
which is less intimidating for a new person, right?
Right. There have been talks in the standards groups and everything about how to better deal with dates and things like that. And so if you come, one of the things we would do is look at those and talk about them. And what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And ideally, is there a polyfill? Really a polyfill, because nobody implements it yet. And we would say, here is this thing that effectively is very close to what you asked for. Now, go out into the world and try it, because you might not like it, right? You might not like it. You'd be surprised at how often that is the case.
Because once something gets all the way through, it's very difficult to roll back.
You can't, yeah. You cannot roll it back once it's through. It's basically, you can't break the web is the motto. And like you said, that sometimes leads to some really ugly stuff, and it's well, why wouldn't you just start over? And it's because living systems are really, really powerful, going back to my evolution thing, right? If I asked you to build the perfect human being, or the perfect fox, or the perfect whatever, you would have some really rigid definition that if you could accomplish it, it might work really, really well in this case. But then as soon as anything about the environment changed or whatever, you would be ill-suited. It's really sometimes the imperfections that are their strengths, really, right? To be adaptable and flexible. And
well, you look at, so think maybe a more specific way to see just how flexible the system is that it has kind of gone from, talk about Tim Berners-Lee a lot, gone from that original idea of sending these text documents to the ideas we now have of progressive web apps. And you look at those two can't be two it can't be more different. Yeah, like just like the core idea of what they are doing. Like sure, yes, like there's still some text being displayed in some places and still linking to different things and stuff like that. But kind of the idea of what it is very different. And the same system that produced one through evolution, as you said, has now produced the other.
Right.
Yeah, there's plenty of things that were part of web development that we don't use anymore, but they still need to work. Some browsers will deprecate tags, for instance, like Blink or something like that. You have new
Does
stuff.
Marquee still work?
I would imagine it does. It doesn't break things though. That's the whole thing. So like you still have that, but maybe it doesn't do the same thing. But if you put a Blink tag in your HTML today, even though it's been taken out of those browsers, it's not going to blow your stuff up.
This is actually a really complex thing. Like, don't break the web. It's shocking how much of a role that plays. There are standards proposals that have had to change, even though everybody said, yeah, that's exactly what it should be. That's what that method should be named. Everybody agreed. And then find out that there's some really fairly popular thing that's used on 2% of the Alexa top 1 million that accounts to a significantly large number, and you can't do that because you'll break all those sites, And it's like that really arcane, obscure stuff that until it was spec'd out, really, to be interoperable at that level would be nearly impossible.
Yeah. Well, we would kind of go back to the same problem we had before, which is what jQuery helps solve, right? Which is everything being, except it would be, more like you'd kind of have to build things for backwards compatibility. Now, like things, progressive enhancement and things like that Eric was mentioning, we're talking about some of the things that polyfills help us do. Mm-hmm. We can look forward because we know the thing that will work in the future will work now. I guess if you can think about it that way, like same like with like all this stuff, the new stuff in ES6 or ES 2015 or whatever else for JavaScript, that the stuff that you will write later, if you could go back, if you could take it the same code, it's still going, for the most, a lot of the things are still going to work. It's not going to blow your stack. ES6 was a terrible example because a lot of those things are not going to work. Will not work in current browsers. But you can through transpiling and stuff like that, you can make them work. Yeah. Again, that was just a terrible example. I'm gonna cut that out.
Cut that in post.
Yeah, fix that.
I mean, I'm looking at the Extensible Web Manifesto. You're one of the co-creators of this. It was something I remember Yahoo Cats tweeted out, and I was like, wow, this is great. Let's take a look at this. And I never really, talked about it on the podcast, I don't think, that much at least. I think it has great goals, and the standardization of the web and pushing things forward. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to create that?
Yeah. So around 2010, I guess, lots of people were starting to realize a lot of the same things, and everybody was sort of similarly unimpressed, which is great, but unless you can kind of corral all those people into some common purpose, that will all be wasted, right? And so we had a lot of discussions, lots of people, Marcos Caceres, myself, Alex Russell, Yahoo Cats. I shouldn't start naming people because then I'm going to leave people out. But we started this community group, and we started talking, and we started trying to bring other people into the community group. And some people kind of couldn't join for business reasons, but they could still talk. And so, basically what we wanted to do is say, I think that we agree on a lot, but unless we can write it down, it's not going to be a thing. Like, we need a vision. We need I don't know, I guess, like, here in America, maybe, I think about it a little bit like maybe the Declaration of Independence. It's just a document, but the day before and the day after, it's sort of markedly different because a number of people came together and they said, this is what we think, and we kind of think that we'd like it if you'd also help us with this vision.
No, I think it's a great example. I think that if you compare it to the Declaration of Independence, though, maybe, I mean, you can't get shot for signing this document, right? So.
Sure. All analogies are leaky abstractions. It is like guiding principles in ECMA, in W3C, in what way. I don't know specifically that it applies to IETF because IETF is sort of broader, and the things that it does on the web a lot are about protocols. And I think that that's the real thing, is that it enabled us to create a movement that got somewhere, because if we didn't get anywhere, then it's just a silly document that we spent too much time trying to get agreement on.
Thanks, Brian. It was great to meet you. It was great to meet you. Like I said, I find a lot of this stuff fascinating, especially things that I just wasn't around for. And so it's cool to hear a little bit more about how they came about. So sorry I have to cut out a little bit early, but I have some RX streams that are not behaving the way that I want to, and I have to make them work.
So jealous.
All right, but bye, guys. It was good to talk with you.
Bye.
Bye, Dean. So if anyone wants to contact Brian Kardell, you can find him on Twitter at Brian Kardell. That's BrianKardell. Or you can go to chapters.io. We didn't get a chance to go too far into chapters.io or some of the other projects like the Extensible Web Manifesto too much. So we may end up doing a second episode to cover a lot of that stuff. But it's been really fun. Thank you so much, Brian Kardell, for coming on. And this has been episode number 101 of the Web Platform Podcast, Browser Wars and Standards Battles. You want to learn more about what's coming on next on the Web Platform Podcast? Follow us on Twitter at the Web Platform, or on Google Plus and YouTube at +the Web Platform. We also need your help in creating transcripts of the episodes and helping to create open source projects under our GitHub organization. Contact Eric Isaacson at eIsaacson,
or Danny Blue at D_Blue. That's DEE_BLOO.
Thank you for listening, everybody, and we'll catch you all next week.